All right. Well, welcome everyone to, I like to call these Saturday classes kind of workshops, but we'll have as much interaction as we can within the space here as well as online. And today's topic is really important one, how to practice Dharma. And these 8 worldly concerns, we're going to spend a fair amount of time looking at these, trying to see how they're operative in our own lives and how we can abandon them. So let's go ahead and start with just a couple of prayers. And again, we generally recite this praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times, but today let's just do this once. And as we're doing this, we're thinking about all the amazing qualities of the Buddha, kind of being kind of in awe of the Buddha's achievement. But that doesn't mean that that's not something we can attain. That's the whole point of all of our practice, is that every one of us can have all of these same qualities that the Buddha possesses and eventually become perfect in serving others. So let's recite this one time with those thoughts in mind. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. The next prayer is the mandala offering. Again, this is to visualize making a very vast, pure offering, to receive the teachings, to try to receive the blessings from all the holy beings so we can actualize these teachings in our own minds. So let's do a visualization of the entire phenomenal world transformed into a beautiful Buddha paradise that we're offering to receive these teachings. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then finally, our refuge in bodhicitta verse, which we'll do first time in English and then twice in Tibetan, trying to cultivate both of these minds, the mind that has safe direction in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, especially the path that we're following, the Dharma, and then also generating the motivation of bodhicitta, which we'll also meditate on shortly. So let's do this again together 3 times. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chenyen gipe sonam gi, dola penchir sangye dupar shok. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chanyen gipe sanam gi, dola penchir sangye duparsho. All right, let's do a short meditation. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit by using the breath as a meditation object for the first few minutes. And I don't think I need to give any instruction on meditation, but whichever way you choose to work with the breath, just bring your focus to the breath and hold it there as best as you can as you inhale, as you exhale. But when you notice that the mind has wandered from the breath, then let go of whatever has distracted you and gently return to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for a few minutes, and then I will lead you in a short reflection to kind of begin to move our minds into today's topic, as well as to set our motivation. So now let's set our motivation by first thinking about this topic that we're looking at today. We called this course How to Practice Dharma. And no doubt many, if not all of us, consider ourselves Dharma practitioners. But when I say that, practice Dharma, what does that mean to you? How do you practice Dharma in the course of a day? Just spend a few minutes reflecting on this. What is your own definition and meaning of being a Dharma practitioner? So, whatever answers we've come up with in our own investigation, we're here today to look at this topic to increase our understanding and our practice, to be able to be much clearer throughout our day in terms of what we are doing and the mind that we are doing those things with. We know from prior teachings that the mind is at the center of everything the Buddha taught. The definition of Dharma is that which protects one from suffering, meaning that which keeps us from creating the causes of our own dissatisfaction and denies us our happiness. So we're here initially with that motivation of wanting to practice Dharma as purely, as forcefully as we can. First, to achieve our own peace, to be free of the causes of our own suffering. That's a very valid goal for us to have. It's the heart of what the Buddha taught, the ability for each of us to attain true freedom, liberation, nirvana, peace. We also want to go beyond that motivation to embrace the welfare of all sentient beings, as we see that the Buddha taught the Dharma as a universal antidote for all beings to be able to achieve the peace that they seek. So set a motivation that encompasses them as well. The mind of bodhicitta that aspires to develop oneself to a degree where we then can help others perfectly. In the state of Buddhahood, we will be able to very clearly, accurately guide every sentient being on their path, helping them to achieve their freedom, their liberation, as well as enlightenment themselves. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes and we'll begin. Hey, so again, this is an interesting topic. I want to share a little bit about the first time that I encountered this topic early on in my practice of Dharma, which we'll talk about in a moment. I want to do a little introduction first, and then I would like to hear some things that people came up with in their reflection on your own practice of the Dharma. But the very first time I came across these teachings was actually relatively soon in my FPMT exposure, at least. I began studying Buddhism to some degree, practicing in 1993. And I found the FPMT through Seichen Ling, our center in San Francisco, where Venerable Rabina was teaching. And I think this was actually one of the courses that she did in that first year that I studied at Seychenling in 1996, was on a book called The Door to Satisfaction. This is the older version of it when it first came out. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche in this book talks a lot about the 8 worldly dharmas. And of course, I was kind of taken by this. Can't say that I'm a perfect practitioner of everything I'm going to be teaching today, but I'm going to use Rinpoche's teachings to a large degree because this is the way that I entered into this topic of the 8 worldly dharmas. And I think it's incredibly valuable to see Rinpoche's words on this. So this is kind of a little bit of the introduction to what this book was about and the central topic of the 8 worldly dharmas. In 1974, Lama Zopa Rinpoche found a text called Opening the Door of Dharma. Nice title, right? Among several in a cave in Nepal, used by his previous incarnation, the Laudo Lama. Rinpoche says this text describes the initial stage of what we often call thought transformation, mind training, which is what Buddhism, again, is all about. In other words, the first thing to practice if you want to practice Dharma. So it's pretty amazing. I actually went back to this book a few years back during the pandemic and taught a little course here for Tupten Norbuling here on this, where we went into the entire book over the course of many more sessions. Nonetheless, at the real heart of it is, again, these 8 worldly dharmas. Rinpoche says, only when I read this text did I come to know what the practice of Dharma really means. During all the years of my life up until then, I had not known. Practicing Dharma is usually regarded as reading scriptures, studying, memorizing, debating, saying prayers, performing rituals, and so forth. Maybe I'll take it off screen here. Were any of those things that you might look at in your own reflection and say, oh, that's how I practice Dharma every day to some degree? Anyone want to share anything that came up for them in their reflection on your own personal practice of Dharma? Again, you don't have to share anything you don't want to. This is just an invitation. Anyone? In the Gompa here, if you do want to say something, please raise your hand, and then Lou will get the microphone so folks online can hear. Anyone online as well? Anyone who would like to share, you can simply unmute. No one? Frank is going to share here in the Gompa. Okay, he'll get things started. Or Lou, actually.
Yeah, I can share.
Okay, and then Frank.
It's Lou DeSantis. And when I first got introduced to Buddhism, I was living in South Florida by myself. And that's how I practiced Dharma, just reading, studying online, all that good stuff. But I never left my house.
You never what?
I never left my house. And then I moved to Santa Fe, and I realized that there was a lot more to it than just being in your room doing Buddhism. You know?
Yeah. I mean, you could probably do practice of Dharma in your room too, but yeah, those are often how things start. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Lou. Frank, did you want to share something then? Right behind you there, Lou. You can just pass the mic. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Frank.
And I'm not as much of a studier. I would guess I'm usually busy, but I just try and keep a motivation to treat people well, be honest and straightforward, and keep my mind a bit under control. Because that's, like you say, that's the main issue, is when your mind spins out of control, then you really aren't doing things effectively or with good Dharma, I'm sure. So that's kind of what I try and keep track of, at least throughout the day.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Frank.
Sure.
We have another response here in the Gompa. But again, if anyone at home needs to share, then you might even work on with your little icon at the bottom, or either you could put something in the chat box as well, but there's a little reactions box at the bottom and you can put your hand up down there. So anyway, yes, Karen, please share.
Because I live so far from a center, I've done a lot of things online, like Louis, and practiced around. I think the hard thing for me, you can read and you can study, but putting it into practice, that's where the rubber meets the road. And I'm really working on that. And I have my partner who says, well, is that what Buddha would do? That's very Buddhist, which brings me right back home to like, oh, yeah, that
Yeah.
isn't very nice or kind or anything. So,
Well, how nice that you have a little reminder with Jim there. So,
yeah, and he's not a Buddhist, so,
right. Yeah.
but he looks to me kind of to be,
Yeah.
I guess, an example. And I realize how short I fall
Yeah.
in that example.
We all do. But it's good that you're seeing that again, that the study is a part of it, but it's the practice. Like you said, where the rubber meets the road. And that's the important part. Yeah. Thank you, Karen, for sharing that. We do have some folks online. Bobby, I think. Hi, Bobby. Good to see you. You can unmute.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, good.
Let me just get the volume turned down a little bit in here, though, I think. Because, Lou, could you turn the volume down just a tad? It's a little muffled, Bobby, and then we can hear you.
And I'm on my headphones. I have technological problems all the time. Can you hear me?
There we go. It's better now.
Okay.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay. So my fantasy of a Dharma practitioner is all that reading, all that meditating, all that sitting, and all that studying. And since I've moved to New Orleans, that's still my fantasy, but I just can't get there. And so my reality of practicing Dharma is just watching my body, speech, and mind. And I feel like I've kind of completed Dharma 101 in that I actually have some capability now to watch that. Sometimes I watch it coming out of my mouth instead of holding on to it. But even if it escapes, I'm getting better at saying, whoops, let's start over. That's not really what I want to say. So it's kind of interesting. I'm doing the opposite of what I think I should be doing, but that's the best I can do.
But that's a lot. Thank you for sharing that, Bobby. Yeah, good to see you again. And then Shayla, please.
Danny said in chat, that's how I initially practiced and studied alone.
Mhm.
Only 10 years ago did I start grasping the importance of compassion and interdependence with others. I
Mhm.
practice every moment of my life, if I can, which is the most difficult.
Definitely. Oh, thanks for sharing that, Shayla. Anyone else want to share anything from your reflection in the meditation today? Tony here in the Gompa, please. I think it's on, yeah.
Hi, Tony Reese. So I wasn't going to say a word. But it's hard for me to keep my mouth shut. And the only reason I'm saying something is because of Don. Don inspired me to say it with one word. He used the word invitation. And in all truth and honesty, that's precisely what happened many years ago, December 3rd, 1957. It's a very long story, and I'll make it short. December 3rd, 1957 was my birthday. My birthdays have always been magical and mystical. I come from a magical and mystical family. And I had to get out of the house. It was like maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I just needed space. There was nothing wrong. I just needed space. So I went for a walk. And as a young child, I was clairaudient and becoming clairvoyant. And I'm just saying what my life has been. And I appreciate that aspect of my life because that's what brought me to the Dharma. Without that, I don't think I ever would have had the invitation to enter. As I was walking down the street looking for space, clairvoyantly I heard 3 words. And the words were, "What is it?" And my entire body shook. It trembled. It was like the earth was quaking. And I knew it was profound. After 47 years of holding those 3 words within my body, I finally came upon the right teacher, the teacher for me.
Mhm.
Daido, Roshi Daido Luri at Zen Mountain Monastery. I happened to come across a periodical that the monastery issues while on vacation in Santa Fe. I was living in Massachusetts.
Mm.
And came across the periodical, saw his photo, and said, this is him. 47 years later, I was like 60 years old, you know?
Yeah.
And I went to the monastery. They offered a introduction to Zen weekend. And I pulled into the parking lot. There's a huge field in front of me. And I swear to you, when I got out of the car, every blade of grass in that field was chanting, what is it? What is it? What is it? I swear to you. That was a Friday evening, orientation thing. Then first thing Saturday morning is the meeting with the teacher, the Roshi, the Daido. We were all sitting in the Buddha room. He came walking in. He sat down, looked around, centered himself, and said, in Zen, the 3 most important words are, what is it? Truly. And thanks for the invitation. And this is not easy to say, but it's absolute and total truth.
Mm-hmm.
The Dharma. It's everywhere. Every blade of grass is chanting the truth of the nature of reality.
Right.
Let's stop there.
No, thank you, Tony, for sharing. And we'll touch on that topic today, I hope, to some degree. Again, what we mean by our Dharma practice has many facets to it, as we saw even with what Rinpoche shared and what all of you shared. I wanted to share, it's on the screen. Oh, it isn't on the screen here, that's right. Danny in the chat room said, that's how I initially practiced and studied alone. Only 10 years ago did I start grasping the importance of compassion and interdependence with others. I practice every moment of my life if I can, which is the most difficult. Thank you for sharing that, Danny. So again, there's lots of answers to that question. What does it mean to practice Dharma? And Dharma can be an extremely profound topic, to what Tony was about. It can also be extremely practical in terms of our everyday interaction with others and what have you. Does anyone else wanted to share anything before we go on? Just want to give that invitation in case there are any other things to share. And let's go ahead and share more of what Rinpoche says. He kind of finishes off this thought, because he says, as he said, he usually regards that reading scriptures, these are all important things. Studying. We have a lot of that here at Thupten Norber Ling, right? Memorizing, not so much in the monasteries they do, debating in the monasteries and so on, saying prayers, performing rituals. These are all things that we do and we consider part of our spiritual practice. He says then, it was only when I read this text that I found out how to practice Dharma. I was very shocked that all my past actions had not been Dharma, even though he did many of those same things that he was attesting to in the previous slide. When I checked back, all those past years of memorizing and saying prayers were not Dharma. From all those years, nothing was Dharma. Opening the door of Dharma, the text that's at the center again of this book, The Door to Satisfaction, describes mainly impermanence and death, the shortcomings of desire, the obstacles created by the 8 worldly dharmas, these 8 worldly concerns that we're going to spend most of the time talking about today. Reading this text was very helpful. It showed me that, like molding dough in your hand, you can definitely turn your mind whichever way you want. It can be trained to turn this way, that way. Again, this is really getting once more at the heart of everything the Buddha taught, is that we're essentially doing mind training. Sometimes we use that phrase in Tibetan, it's lojong, often translated as thought transformation or mind training, as a specific practice that's within the Mahayana tradition. And there it does have some relevancy, but it's everything the Buddha taught is mind training. Training our minds, changing our minds. Our minds are the source of all of our suffering. Our minds are the source of all of our happiness. So again, this is the main foundation for everything that we're looking at today. Well, let's go into exploring a bit more of what Rinpoche says. Again, I'll be sharing quotes from Rinpoche here and there. The main gist of it is to be kind of a spur into getting the topics discussed that we need to talk about today. This is the agenda for today, in a sense. I'm going to start with just a few slides that have to do with the recognition that what we have here in this human opportunity is an incredible opportunity that is rich with meaning. And that's the whole premise for why we need to attend to these 8 worldly dharmas. That'll be the next topic, giving up this life and abandoning the 8 worldly dharmas. And that's going to be the bulk of today. But of course, how do we work with the 8 worldly dharmas? By cutting off desire and subduing our minds. And then, of course, we can change our minds often through more positive motivations, through the thoughts that we bring in that are more virtuous. And then this conclusion to Rinpoche's book that also is really relevant, having no choice but to practice Dharma. If we really care for ourselves, if we really want happiness and want to be free from suffering, there's no choice. You know, we have to get on that pursuit of the Dharma and really practice it wholeheartedly. So this is Rinpoche's little introduction about what we have to look at in terms of the basis for the relevancy of these teachings. He says the great Bodhisattva Shantideva says in A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, a really important text in our tradition, this perfect human body, qualified by what we call the freedoms and richnesses, which are, I won't go into in detail. These are the ways that we can look at this human life and see how relevant it is, how important it is, because we are free from a lot of the things that we would have to experience and be obstructed by in other states of existence. And we are endowed with richnesses, with amazing opportunities, having met the Dharma and the ability to meet and practice the Dharma that make this life very important. So he says that this perfect human body is extremely difficult to find. If one does not attempt to obtain the benefits of this human body now while we have it, how will one receive another in the future? This is really, again, a teaching that is at the very beginning of what we call the Lam Rim. There's going to be a little bit on the Lam Rim in a moment. Most of you are familiar with that. It's one of the main topics in this tradition. It's the way that we can put all of what the Buddha taught into a course of practice and study to change our minds. And it begins with recognizing the incredible good fortune that we have. You know, this human rebirth didn't come about through no causes and conditions. We have it because we created everything that has resulted in this existence. Now that we have it, we have to take advantage of it and use it. And that's the premise for why we need to look at these 8 worldly concerns, because they're a way that we will actually waste and squander this human existence. This human life is so important. And we all do it to some extent. I mean, even great practitioners probably aren't using every single moment of their life to practice Dharma. Again, we'll be examining that topic of what it really means to practice Dharma. But nonetheless, that's the direction we want to be moving in, recognizing that while we have this existence that is very difficult to get, according to the Buddha's teachings, this is something that we come across every now and then, and we have to be very diligent in creating the causes and conditions to have it again. Otherwise, we could end up in an unfortunate state and not have the same opportunities that we currently possess. So this is the premise for why we're looking at these teachings, is to understand that our life has incredible importance and meaning if we are able to take advantage of it. Happiness and suffering come from your own mind, not from outside. Sound familiar? I just said it a few minutes ago, right? And this is, again, the basic teaching that the Buddha gives us all the time. We can't have this focus on the external world. We have to focus on the internal world. Goes on to say, your own mind is the cause of happiness. Your own mind is the cause of suffering. To obtain happiness and pacify suffering, you have to work within your own mind. The workshop is within your mind. You know, this is again, something I don't need to probably emphasize, but I'm wanting to at least share Rinpoche's words because I think it's important that we continually remind ourselves of that. We look at the world that we live in, certainly most beings and even ourselves to some degree, and certainly prior to our meeting the Dharma, we probably had a lot of external focus to our lives, right? This is how most people live their lives. Kind of think, well, if I get all these various little building blocks in place, here's my work life, here's my family life, and here's my, social life, and here's, my interests and things, hobbies, what have you. If I get all these little boxes in place and they're all perfect, they're all exactly what I need for my well-being and happiness in the moment, then I've got it made, right? That's the goal in many people's minds in this world. Kind of get the external situation to be exactly how we want it to be, and then we'll be happy. I'm not recognizing that the happiness comes from within. It doesn't come from these external things. I'm not saying they don't produce pleasurable sensations and feelings and cause you to have some measure of happiness. Just are they true happiness? Something we're going to look at today as we look at this topic, because the 8 worldly dharmas are the things that we follow thinking that we're going to get that happiness. But is it real happiness? Is it the happiness that we really can rely upon, count upon, and develop to a greater degree? So Rinpoche then says, if you understand that Lam Rim, again, Lam Rim is Tibetan for Lam is path, Rim means graduated, gradual stages, the idea being that we have a degrees of development that we go through on our path. The graduated path to enlightenment, Lam Rim Jongchup, would be the full Tibetan of that. Then you know the benefits you can receive from this perfect human body because they're spelled out in the 3 levels of the Lam Rim. The first benefit is happiness of future lives, which means receiving the body of a happy migrating being such as a god or a human. We have to have the causes and conditions to be able to have another experience like this one. And of course, all of this is based on the concept that mind is continuous. Our minds go back without any beginning. Our minds go forward without any end. And this little kind of bookended existence of starting with our conception in this human life to our last breath and the exit of our consciousness from this human body. This is one chapter in our many, many chapters of existence that we've had. What is the next chapter? We can have an effect upon the next chapter by what we do in this life. That's the very first level of practice. I'm not going to go into the full Lam Rim, but that's how we start our spiritual practice is recognizing that this life is fleeting and impermanent. It will end, and we have to be concerned about what comes after it. The second benefit is a bigger goal, a more lasting goal: liberation from samsara, release forever from the bondage of karma and delusion. I mentioned this briefly in our motivation today, right? That we can attain a state of peace for ourselves, nirvana. The Buddha set out very clearly how to do that. Again, that's a very noble goal. And it's one that many practitioners are inclined towards, is their own self-liberation. Nothing wrong with that. For what it is, that's the path that the Buddha taught. But there's something beyond that. There's a goal we can achieve beyond that, which is full enlightenment, Buddhahood, where we then can help others. And that speaks to the 3rd level of the stages of the path. The 3rd is attainment of the non-abiding sorrowless state, full enlightenment, the cessation of the 2 types of obscuration, the disturbing thought obscurations and the obscurations to omniscience. I'm not going to go into full description of these, but essentially what keeps us from being liberated are the first of these: the disturbing thought obscurations, the afflictive obscurations, the things that are afflictions in our own minds, and the ignorance that's at the root of all of our problems. That's what's keeping us from being liberated. What's keeping you from being a Buddha, an omniscient being, are the obscurations to omniscience. And these are subtler imprints in the mind. But the goal eventually is to want to bring ourselves to that level of evolution and development, to become fully enlightened for the sake of others. Well, Rinpoche is pointing out that in this human life, you have the ability to achieve all 3 benefits, especially since we have in this unique Tibetan Buddhist perspective, the ability to attain enlightenment in a single lifetime through the practice of Tantra. So again, I'm not going to go into all those teachings. I actually begin teaching a little course on grounds and paths of Tantra this coming Thursday. And that's for people who've had initiation into highest yoga Tantra. But the Buddha set out this full path. The Buddha said you can achieve whatever you want with this life in terms of more happiness of next life, happiness of liberation, happiness of enlightenment. Pretty amazing. I mean, we don't recognize the value that we have in this life. And you kind of walk down the street and see everyone kind of going about their business, especially here in Santa Fe in the summer, and all the tourists coming here to see all the sights and do things and what have you. And you can get very distracted in samsara, right? All these, shiny baubles and things that you get kind of totally caught up in. And we don't recognize that we can do this internal work and we can actually achieve amazing things. So that's, again, the premise for why we're looking at this topic of the eight worldly dharmas, because as we're going to see, what keeps us from actually engaging in this life fully with that motivation of using this life for the greatest benefit is the eight worldly dharmas. These patterns that we get caught up in that keep us preoccupied with all the shiny objects, so that we don't use this life well. So again, this is just setting the stage for this. It is these three benefits or levels of happiness that Shantideva refers to in the verse I mentioned earlier, and that he means we should obtain with this present perfect human rebirth. In order to receive these three benefits, we need to follow the graduated paths of the three levels of capability, of the three capable beings, as we often call them, how Rinpoche would refer to them. So this is just pointing to, again, that we have the teachings there. And the study is important. We do a lot of courses on the Lam Rim and the FPMT at all the various centers. It's all about becoming familiar with the stages of development so that we can actually engage in these teachings. But if you don't address the eight worldly concerns, none of that process begins. You might think that you're doing all these wonderful Dharma things, many of the things that were mentioned, studying and meditating and what have you, but you might even be doing them with worldly concern. It's the importance of looking at this topic, because otherwise we might find ourselves wasting this human life, getting to the end of this life and having nothing to show for it. So that brings us to the main topic that we're going to be dealing with. Actually, before I go on, I might mention that all of these slides, I will be doing a PDF file of them and get them to Venerable Dundrup, and it might be a few days, but he'll put a little course materials link on the page for this course. So if you go back to the calendar and click on that page, it'll take you to a page, and there will be eventually a course materials link there. There'll be one other document there that I'm going to share with all of you a little bit later. This is, again, the main topic that we're going to be looking at is how do we actually make sure that we use this life well to benefit. And again, in the Lam Rim, the minimal benefit that we want to have from this life is at least to have created the causes for another existence like this one. And know that for most of us, that will probably be the main thing we focus on. Our liberation and enlightenment are part of the picture, and we want to bring that motivation into our practice. But for many of us, we're going to need a continuity of good rebirths in order to achieve this path. There's a lot to this Tibetan Buddhist path, right? I mean, most of you have been around this a while, and you know that there are many different meditations, and in the Lam Rim, many different topics. Gaining realizations isn't easy. We have to do a lot of meditation. But once more, if we don't address these worldly concerns, we don't even get our foot in the door. We don't even actually be assured that we have created the causes for a good rebirth when we get to the end of this life. So one thing I want to do in introducing this topic of giving up this life, I'll tell a little story. There's two of them. One was told about Atisha in Lama Zopa's book, but he's also mentioned on occasion the story of Drom Tompa. Drom Tompa was Lama Atisha's main disciple. Most of you know Lama Atisha because he's the one who brought the Lam Rim teachings to Tibet about 1,000 years ago. It's said that he was actually told that his life would be shortened by a number of years if he made the journey to Tibet and taught there. And then went on, this was like an emanation that appeared before him, I think in the form of Tara, that said, yes, you'll have a shorter life if you go to Tibet, but there will be incredible benefit. And we are benefiting from that incredible benefit from Lama Atisha, having made that mountainous journey into Tibet to teach the Lam Rim, to give us these teachings that we still rely upon today. Anyway, Lama Atisha's his main Tibetan disciple was Drom Tompa. And Drom Tompa, one day, he walked by seeing a practitioner who was a monk or something on the grounds of the monastery, and he was circumambulating a stupa. Most of you know these stupas that are reliquaries. They represent the holy mind of the Buddha. We have one in the lobby here at Thupten Norbuling. Anyway, one of these large structures, as they call them chortens, I think, in Tibetan, he was doing his circumambulation, walking clockwise around this. And Trungpa says, you know, it's good to do circumambulation of stupas, but it's even better to practice Dharma. And so this got the monk thinking, and he goes, well, maybe I should be, you know, reciting mantras then or something. So he's sitting there and he's reciting mantras the next day. And Trungpa comes up and says, you know, it's good to recite mantras, but it's even better to practice Dharma. And then monk's all kind of befuddled, like, you know, what is he talking about? And then he decides he's going to meditate. So he sits and meditates, and Trungpa walks past and sees him meditating, and he says, you know, it's good to meditate, but it's better to practice Dharma. And the monk's like totally frustrated. He's like, well, tell me, what does it mean to practice Dharma then? What do you mean, practice Dharma? And he says, you must give up this life. Of course, through Trungpa's amazing clairvoyance, his ability to see the mind of this monk, he knew that there was still a taint of worldly concern. Again, this gets to be a touchy topic, because I'm not telling you that every one of you needs to like abandon all of your worldly things and go live in a cave and kind of that's your life now, eating nettles like Milarepa did or something, and you know turning green while you're meditating and what have you. That's not what our path necessarily is. There may be a select few who have that path, but for most of us, it means still being in the world, but changing how our mind relates to the world and to these worldly dharmas. As we're going to see, we'll see a little quote from Rinpoche a little later today. The problem is not having these things in our lives, because every one of us has these things in our lives. We have material things. We have, all of these praise that we receive from others. We have criticism that we get. We have all of these things going on in our lives. This is just what it means to be a human being in the 21st century, right? And of course, it's not just unique to the 21st century. I'm just saying this is just standard life. But how are we relating to those things? The problem, once more, is in our own minds. It's the patterns of our own minds and how we think about those things that causes them to be a problem. You could have all the wealth in the world, and it wouldn't be a problem if you didn't have a mind that was relating to that wealth in an erroneous way, in a way that was not capable of actually producing the causes of happiness. So let's take a look at this and how Rinpoche introduces this. First, this is the actual text, or one part of the text. I only have a couple of quotes from the text, called Opening the Door Dharma, which, by the way, this Lodro Gelton, he's, again, or Gelton, he's the one who composed this text that Rinpoche found in 1974. It has never been translated in its entirety, and it's not really even that much of it that's in there, but I think it's actually a collection of verses that were his own advice, as well as verses that he has found that have to do with this practicing of Dharma. So in terms of what he says in that, he says, it is extremely important to attempt not to generate desire for this life's happiness. If this desire arises, attempt to abandon it. In order to take the essence from the very beginning, one should not cling to this life. I want to explain a few words in here. We use this word desire. Sometimes we use desire in a very positive way, right? Like the desire for enlightenment, for the sake of all beings. I'm not talking about desire in that context. What we're going to be talking about today in terms of these 8 worldly dharmas, and when it says cutting off desire, that's a topic we're going to get to next after we finish the 8 worldly dharmas, which again we'll be with for a little while. But desire doesn't mean a healthy desire, like a desire for liberation, a desire for enlightenment, and so on. Desire is equivalent to what we often call one of these root poisons, these root afflictions, the mind of attachment. Attachment is our response generally, or our reaction, let's put it that way, because I like that word reaction. When it comes to illusions, we kind of keep reacting. We keep doing the same thing again and again. It is our reaction to things which are pleasant in our lives. We can do a little bit of Buddhist psychology here, going into the mind and what happens in the mind. Whenever you are cognizant, and even when you're not cognizant, probably when you're sleeping and what have you, there is a feeling that is being registered in your mind. There are 3 different types of feelings. You have a feeling of pleasantness, And you have a feeling of unpleasantness, and you have a neutral feeling. Now, there are gradations of each of these, right? Pleasantness can go from, having a small cool breeze on a hot day in the summer to having, the amazing meals that we are able to produce in this world and the deliciousness that comes from them. You can have all kinds of pleasant experiences that are on a huge scale, from minor ones to major ones. You can have unpleasant experiences that are also on that gradation, from very slight things such as having a hangnail to, having incredible pain and difficulty with these bodies or minds that we have. So again, you can experience many things that are in that category of pleasantness or unpleasantness, but we still would categorize them on the basis of our own assessment of those. And we all know what produces pleasure for us and what produces unpleasantness for us, displeasure. But there's also neutral. In Buddhism, we don't talk about the neutral so much. Why? Because it doesn't really do a whole lot. We have good parts of our day, though, where I'd say we're probably in a pretty neutral mode. We're just sort of hanging out and waiting for something pleasant to happen and hoping something unpleasant doesn't happen. Those are the three feeling tones that are happening at any moment. They trigger a particular reaction. The pleasant feelings, generally, with people who haven't trained their minds, triggers attachment. Attachment is a mind that focuses on all the pleasantness that is happening at that moment, and particularly the objects that bring us pleasure, the sources of those pleasure, and makes that the sum total of those objects. Kind of paints pleasure over the entire picture. Thinks that the pleasure is greater than what it is. I'm not denying that there's pleasure there when you have something delicious that you eat, or beautiful music that you listen to, or whatever the case might be. It's just, what is the nature of that pleasure? You have probably exaggerated it in your own mind, to where you think, oh, this is the best dessert I've ever had, or this is the most beautiful music I've ever heard, da 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 da, right? And then you get the attachment is like getting stuck to the object. This is a phrase actually that Venerable Pema Chodron uses a lot in her teachings, is getting stuck. She uses the Tibetan term shenpa, which is sometimes translated as attachment. We get stuck onto things. And this is especially happening, we see it with attachment, but it also happens with our other experiences. We'll get to them in a moment. When we have something pleasant that occurs, suddenly we get totally immersed in it. And we don't want to let it go, right? We want to keep experiencing that. Well, this is a source of problem for us. We're going to have difficulty if this is how we live our lives. Everything pleasant that comes into our experience, we just grasp at, want to keep going, having these pleasant experiences. Because first of all, they're not going to lead to lasting peace and happiness. They're conditional. They're only conditioned when you have that source of that pleasant feeling, that pleasant experience. And this is how most people live their lives. I mean, I'm not denying that we live our lives this way sometimes too. I'm not trying to make us seem like we're better than everyone else. But if we look at the world at large, most people are all about trying to keep things in that pleasant category. I keep putting another penny in, another nickel in, I keep getting more pleasure out. I keep getting that pleasure. It keeps feeding me. We're all kind of like addicts, essentially. Venerable Robina said once, we're all like junkies born into a world of junk. This is the world of junk that we live in. We got all this stuff and we just keep going after it and trying to get more and more of it. I can have more of that and more of this and try a little bit of that. And I'm always amazed at these people who spend, again, I'm not putting anyone down, but some people spend their lives searching the world for all kinds of exotic food experiences or certain things that they can, have. I mean, it's kind of absurd, the lengths that people go to try to get these temporary experiences of pleasure, thinking that if they keep that going, you kind of don't have so many gaps where you're not having that wonderful experience in your life, that then you've lived a good life. You kind of lived life like sucking the marrow out of the life. What is that phrase? It's I think it's from Thoreau, isn't it? The idea is that that's not the meaning of life, to extract all the pleasure that we can out of everything, because it only induces more and more attachment. They use the phrase that it's like drinking salt water to quench your thirst. You just keep feeding your thirst, having more and more desire for things. This is the nature of this mind of attachment. Okay, let's go to the second feeling. The second feeling tone that we have is unpleasantness. Well, what happens there? Because our default mode is really to want the pleasurable experiences. You're continually investing in that, continually wanting that. When we get thwarted in that, then the mind gets really bent out of shape, right? Suddenly we have these unpleasant experiences. Suddenly we go to our favorite restaurant, order our favorite dish, and it shows up and it doesn't taste anything like it normally tastes. And it's overcooked or it's raw, one or the other. I mean, suddenly we get really bent out of shape because we wanted what our attachment was expecting. Continuing to feed that mind of attachment. So the second one we can say is what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants. This is how Venerable Urbina often talks about it. When we have the unpleasant experience, well, what's the reaction that we have to that? Habitually, it's to push away, to have a negative reaction, to complain, to get really upset, to maybe even get angry at people and what have you, because we didn't get what we wanted. Of course, this is playing out in our world in terms of a lot of things. It's not just going to a restaurant. This is the world that we live in. We really want it to be the way we want it to be, and we don't want anything that is opposed to that. And we are intent upon that being the result, or we get very upset. We vacillate between these two. I'm not going to talk about neutral again that much. Neutral feelings tend to dull us out. We don't really have much reaction at all, except that kind of getting sort of spaced out, dull, confused maybe even. But these two, of having the pleasant and the unpleasant, Lama Yeshe says we're like a yo-yo. We just go up and down. We go from, oh, I'm getting what I want. I'm happy. Everything's wonderful. Life is delicious and delightful. And then the next day, something happens and we go, oh God, it's miserable. I'm suffering so much. This is unbearable. Right? This is the story that we tell ourselves whenever we're going through this vacillating between these two. So essentially what we're talking about in regard to this mind of attachment that is involved in this life is that pattern that we need to break. And the 8 worldly dharmas are the way that we can put a label on that pattern in terms of the categories of things that tend to be the triggers for us. And some of them are huge in terms of what they encompass. Some of them are a little narrower. And as we go through these, you'll find that some of them are more resonant for each of you and some of them are not. You might look at them and go, well, no, that's not really my trigger right now. That's not really what's going on in my life. But nonetheless, I would encourage you as we go through all of these to take a hard look at them and to really, see for yourself, what is going on, what is happening. One other thing before we continue, I realized little kind of housekeeping things that I forgot to mention at the beginning. We have 2 2-hour sessions. We're almost halfway through the first 2-hour session. And that is coming up shortly. I'm going to do a short break after I introduce these 8 worldly dharmas. I like to do a break in the 2-hour classes because I know it's a lot, especially for folks who are online, to sit behind a camera and what have you on your computer. And then even the folks here to be able to stand up and get a little bit of a stretch break. So just hang in there. There'll be a little stretch break. Then again, we'll have an hour and a half for lunch. And we'll do the same for the 2-hour session in the afternoon. So let's go back again to what Rinpoche says about this verse. And this is the lines from Lodro Gyaltsen where he says, we have to abandon desire. In order to take the essence of this life from the very beginning, one should not cling to this life. One should not cling to the transitory experiences of this life, getting all stuck and caught up in patterns of attachment and anger based on whether we're experiencing something pleasant or unpleasant. Whether we are a Dharma practitioner or not, Rinpoche says, every problem in life comes from our own mind, as does every happiness. The cause of suffering is not external. The cause of happiness is not external. So all those things that we were talking about, when you have those pleasant feelings that are arising on the basis of our various sensory experiences, what have you, all of those things are not real cause of our happiness. And all the things that we experience that are unpleasant are not the cause of our suffering. The cause of what we experience, he says, is within us, in our own mind. Of course, this gets into, we're going to talk a little bit about the topic of karma as we go through today. And hopefully many of you have studied the topic of karma, but karma is essentially the way in which we create these experiences. When you have an experience of something delightful, delicious, friends that you spend a good time with and what have you, and you enjoyed the evening, that's the product of your own good karma of the past. If you have a miserable experience, you get into an accident, you have to pay lots of money to get your car repaired, that's the product of your own unfortunate karma, the karma that you made with a mind that was not so skillful. This is a nice sort of schema, a working hypothesis for how we look at our lives. Everything that is arising is a product of our own past actions. It gives us responsibility to look at that and say, okay, what do I learn from that? And how do I create the causes for what I want to actually experience? To see that this is how we actually have these experiences of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, is through what we have created in our own minds through our karma. And I'm not going to do a whole lesson on karma, that's a whole nother topic. But that's essentially what the Buddha says. We are the creators of our own destiny. We are the creators of everything that we experience, all the way up to Buddhahood. And how wonderful. We're the ones that get to mold our lives, as Rinpoche was saying, into whatever we want. We saw that quote a little while ago, right? You know. So again, this is what we're dealing with in terms of these 8 worldly dharmas. Stop giving the onus to the things outside of you, and give the onus to your own mind. And I keep getting okay. And what is that particular thing that creates every problem we experience in life? It is the dissatisfied mind of desire, the mind clinging to this life. We try to obtain the immediate happiness of this life through what are called the 8 worldly dharmas. So this is the mechanism by which we get caught up in this life and don't actually practice Dharma. I might mention this word Dharma. I introduced it earlier as meaning that which protects us from suffering. That's the holy Dharma. That's the Dharma that Tony was referring to. And eventually what we see is the Dharma of the truth of reality, as Tony was explaining, is what will hold you back from all suffering. Because once we see that truth and develop that wisdom, then nothing can arise that will cause any disturbance to our minds or any problems or difficulties. The term Dharma, as it's being used here in the 8 worldly dharmas, is referring to just phenomena. It's Dharma, essentially, the word cha in Tibetan. It means phenomenon as its kind of broader level. It's used with a capital D, Dharma, when we refer to the Dharma of the Buddha. But Dharma can refer to just anything. These 8 worldly dharmas here are just our normal way of going about dealing with the world. It's our worldly dharma, not holy dharma. That's why it's not capitalized with a D. So this is, and what Rinpoche is saying is that this is the main thing that we need to be free of, are these 8 worldly concerns. So I'm going to introduce them on the next slide, and then we will take a little break. They are in 4 sets of pairs, so we come up with a total of 8. And just as we saw with pleasant and unpleasant, those 2 being the main triggers that cause us to have problems and difficulties, they are set out with something that is pleasant, that we are attached to continuing to get and to have in our lives, and a craving to be free of what is unpleasant. So we can call them both attachments or cravings or desires, because essentially our default desire is to have all these pleasant things and to avoid what is unpleasant. So that's kind of how we consider them all to be in the nature of desire, is because we desire a life that is full of all the wonderful, delightful, delicious things and free of all of the negative things. I mean, I find it kind of interesting. Venerable Ravina, when she taught once, she questioned this person who would say things, I think it was a teaching on karma, and they would say things like, well, Venerable Ravina, I hear you say that everything that we experience is a result of our karma, but what about the young child who dies at a very early age, especially through some violence or something, abuse? And she says that she found it interesting. I'm not going to answer that question, by the way, but, but she said, I find it interesting that we always think that everything is supposed to be good, right? Everything is supposed to be wonderful. That's our default motivation every day of our lives, pretty much. Everything's going to go the way I want it to. I'm going to have a good day. And we even wish that to others. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with wishing others to have a good day. That's a nice thought, right? May you have a good day, have a great time. But when we have that default mode of thinking that everything is going to go our way, that we're not going to have to face the reality of a world where young children do die, and through violence, and through what's happening in Gaza, what have you. You have lots of atrocities, lots of horrible things going on in this world. And yes, it would be a wonderful world if you didn't have any of that suffering, and if none of that was going on. But why do we have that expectation that everything is supposed to be exactly the way we want it, and anytime it isn't, there's something wrong, This is part of this psychology that we're dealing with, that we're trying to overcome by looking at these worldly concerns. What is it that's driving us to have those sorts of expectations? So that we live our lives continually thinking, I'm supposed to be getting what I want and what I need all the time, every moment of the day. Traffic is supposed to be good for me here, that there's not going to be a line at the bank when I go in, and there's, all the products that I want to buy at the grocery store are going to be on the shelf and fresh and delicious and delightful. Well, that's our expectation, right? Again, get bent out of shape when it's not like that. So let me introduce these guys, and then we'll do a short little break. On the very next slide, you have these pairs. We're going to go into these in more detail in the rest of today, in these remaining time that we have together. The first is a craving for material possessions, for things. We know how much things mean a lot in this world, right? I even remember that bumper sticker that somebody, I saw it on the car at least once. He who dies with the most things wins, something like he who dies with. I mean, is that true? I mean, what do you win? You can't take a single thing with you. Anyway, we have a lot of craving for material possessions. And as I go through these, again, pick up your own, just initial, as I introduce them. To what degree are these a trigger for you? And then the pair with that, the other side of it is craving to be free from a lack of material possessions. Sometimes this pair is called gain and loss. Like just think, when you go home and you check your mail for Saturday, how different you would feel if you open your mailbox and there was a check in there that you weren't expecting. Maybe somebody sending you some money that you've forgotten about, or this just being, a relative is being kind and sending you something. Now think what you're going to feel like if you get a bill. You go home and there's a bill there that you weren't expecting. Oh my gosh, I went to the doctor, 2 months ago, and now I've got to pay all this money. So again, we see how these two are a trigger for many of us. 3 and 4, craving for, this is kind of interesting. We say happiness and comfort. We mean that tendency we have to want those pleasurable sensory experiences and to be comfortable. These kind of go together. Because usually when we're getting those happy experiences, we are comfortable, right? We go to a restaurant, we're comfortable with the food that we're getting because it's exactly what we expected. It's delicious, it's delightful, da 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 da. And we want to be free from unhappiness and discomfort. I'm not saying that at the very basic level of us desiring to be happy and free from suffering, that there's a problem with that, because there we can interpret that as what we're really seeking is more lasting peace and happiness. This is the temporary happiness that we get caught up in. These experiences, again, of continually bringing new pleasurable stuff into our lives and having that comfortable experience of being with those. And we don't want the unpleasantness, the unhappiness, and the discomfort. 5 and 6 are maybe, again, for some of us, more important than others, craving for a good reputation, just being thought of in a nice way by the world at large, the people in our circle of community, friends, what have you, having a good rep, and craving to be free from a bad one, right? We don't want generally people to be thinking poorly of us in a very general way. Oh, did you, hear about that Don Handrick, that horrible teacher, and da 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 da. If we start hearing that our reputation is going downhill, well, then we get very bent out of shape, right? Craving for praise and to be free from criticism. This is a little more direct. Reputation is kind of a broader way that we have things going on in the worlds that we live in, our workplace, community, family, what have you, where people think well of us. Praise and criticism is when somebody's actually throwing those words at you that can be words of praise, like throwing flowers at you when you're on the stage and they throw the bouquets, done a beautiful aria or something. That's, what we like to receive, right? And we don't want to hear somebody booing us and throwing tomatoes, right? Okay, so these are what we're going to be looking at for today. This is the primary topic. Again, we'll touch on the few other things that I put on the screen. Begin to already start thinking about this. What are the ones that trigger you? Maybe it's all 8. Maybe, and that's okay. I'm not saying, you should beat yourself up because all 8 of them are triggers. This is good medicine. This is the way we want to be looking at our lives and seeing, kind of holding up a mirror and saying, what is it that is going on for me? As I live my life, as I go about my daily business, what are the things I get stuck in? What are the patterns of reacting to pleasant and unpleasant, something that I'm drawn towards, something that I'm drawn away from? And to what degree do those things control my life and keep me from practicing Dharma? That's the whole point of this. I mean, it's not just they become kind of distractions in their own way and that we just kind of waste this life in a more temporal way. We're wasting our lives incredibly if we get totally caught up in these. And then by the end of our life, we go, okay, what have I done with my life? All right, let's take a short break. If you have any questions, please write them down and we'll have an opportunity when we come back. Let's take 10 minutes. We've got 11:10 here in the Gompa, so at 11:20 we'll reconvene. Okay. All right, so let's see if there are any questions or comments before we delve into these 8 worldly concerns. None? Okay. What? Yeah, Frank, actually, let's get the microphone to Frank just behind you there, Lou. That's all right. And maybe close the, actually, we got folks coming in yet probably, but we need to close the door, I think, for the Tai Chi folks. Okay.
Oh, I was just going to say, looking at those, it's, there's the 2 aspects of each. And I was thinking, oh, they're kind of the same thing. But then I started to think about like the need for praise. I was thinking, well, I don't really have issues with that. That's not an issue for me. But then I was thinking, yeah, but I don't like people not, I sort of, the way I live my life, it's not an issue. But then I was thinking, well, but what's my motivation for that? Because
Sure.
in a way, I don't need praise, but I don't want to be thought of poorly, or I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want the backside of that. So maybe I need to question my motivations
Sure.
for what I'm doing with that. So anyway,
That's a good point. No, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I think, and we're going to see in some of what Rinpoche even shares on this. By the way, one thing I might mention before we go too far as well, the door to satisfaction will be quoted on some of my slides as well, but I might mention this other book that is actually called the same title as this course, How to Practice Dharma. It's by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and I don't know if the hard copy is still available through Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive, but again, that'll be in the slides. You'll see that title. Those are all of his teachings on the 8 worldly dharmas. And the 8 worldly dharmas aren't really taught that much in the Lam Rim. They usually appear in the context of death and looking at death and the fact that if we get to our death and we haven't really taken advantage of this life, then we'll have shortchanged ourselves. But yes, I think we each have to look at these in terms of interpreting our own thing and what is our motivation for why we want praise from others or why we get maybe have an expectation. Lama Zopa will share some of his own insights and observations on how these things can be very subtle sometimes. Yes, they're overt for many people where we get quite involved in wanting things in a particular way and wanting to avoid the opposite of those. But they can also be very subtle. Any other comments or questions? Thanks, Frank. So let's go into these. These are, again, an interesting topic. What I find myself is that the first 2 tend to be the meatier ones to really spend a bit of time with. And even the first one for some people is maybe not as big. But we live in a material world, right? George Harrison said that, right? So we're living in a material world. Just have a little bit more before we go into that first one. He says, a worldly dharma is an object of the thought of either attachment or aversion. I already explained that, okay? And my talking about these 2 feeling tones that we have of pleasantness and unpleasant, that we have the habitual reaction of attachment or aversion. He says then, it is either an object of worldly pleasure that we cling to and desire to have, or an object of suffering that we dislike and desire to be free of or not experience. I'm going to emphasize it again. We're not talking about the Buddha or Rinpoche or anybody saying you shouldn't want happiness and want to avoid suffering. That's the premise for everything the Buddha taught, is that that's sort of the way in which we are living our lives, is we do seek happiness and want to avoid suffering. He's getting at a deeper issue here of how we actually go about that task. And if all we do is look at the happiness that we are experiencing from these transitory pleasures that we have in our lives and getting attached to them, we're actually creating the causes for suffering and not happiness. And if we try to have this craving that wants to avoid all of the unfavorable stuff, we're going to only create the causes for more suffering as well, even though we're trying to avoid suffering. We're going to see a little slide on that coming up, as well as another quote from Master Shantideva, where he says essentially the same thing. We're just confused. And the Buddha observed sentient beings just from his own experience with himself as well. And he said, okay, this is our fundamental desire to be happy, to be free from suffering, but we're just going about it in a totally wrong way. We're not actually creating the causes for happiness. We're creating the causes for more suffering. So this is the point that Rinpoche is making here, is that when we have the worldly dharmas, we are getting caught up in patterns that actually are erroneous. They're only going to create more problems and difficulty because all they do is induce attachment and aversion. Attachment and aversion are two of those root poisons, those root delusions. The other one being ignorance. That's at the heart of all of them. So we'll talk about ignorance maybe a little bit later today. Then he says, whenever there's the thought of the worldly dharmas, clinging to shelter, food, clothing, and so forth, then there's worry and fear about losing them. Whenever there's attachment to comfort, there's fear of losing it. Whenever there's attachment to receiving material things, there's fear of not receiving them, right? This is what happens. We kind of have a default expectation that we're going to get it, then there's fear of not having it or losing it. Whenever there's attachment to praise, there's fear of being criticized. Whenever there's attachment to a good reputation, there's fear of receiving a bad one. That's the fundamental suffering. Not having the four desirable objects is suffering, but so is having them. This is the one thing that he keeps emphasizing in his teachings. I didn't put it on the screen numerous times, as I'm going to maybe emphasize it, but he says, again, having these four in our lives is a problem in the same way that not having them in our lives is a problem. Right now, again, most of us would say, yeah, it is a problem to lose things, to be criticized, to have unpleasant experiences, to have a bad reputation. But we don't think that having things, receiving praise, having a good reputation, and what's the fourth one that I'm missing? Oh, having the comfort and pleasant, or the discomfort and pleasant experiences, that these are a problem. These four are a problem as much as these four are a problem. Most beings in their worldly attitude only think that these four are the problem when I don't get what I want. As long as I'm getting what I want, hey, life's good. It's another bumper sticker, right? Life is good. I always question that one. I want to put like a little asterisk, except for aging, suffering, illness, death, I mean, seriously, it's a little misguided to say life is good when you can point to so many aspects of life that's not so good. So anyway, I think we need some new bumper stickers. Okay. So again, not having the four desirable objects of suffering, but so is having them, and because of attachment, being afraid of losing them. We are Venerable Robina talked once about how fear is kind of the undercurrent of all of these delusions. There's a fear once we're like, will I get what I want? Will I get what I want? And then once you get it, oh, will I lose it? Will I not have it? Will somebody take it away from me? Oops. Normally, we feel unhappy only when dislike arises, when the happiness of this life has been disturbed in some way, usually when we've encountered something undesirable. And we feel happy when there's no such dislike arising, but rather we've encountered one of the four desirable objects. In fact, our definition of happiness is meeting an object of attachment. By the way, these bold letters I put on there, these are not in Rinpoche's works or anything. Our definition of happiness is meeting an object of attachment. I thought that was an important one to highlight, because this is so I say, look at the world around us and how people are living their lives, and to some degree that can be a way of learning. But look at it for ourselves. How often when somebody says, "How is life going?" we'll say, "Oh yeah, I've been pretty happy lately because, this thing's gone really well. My project that I'm working on at work is, really coming to fruition, and everyone's being really, everything's going well, right?" And then you say the opposite, if the opposite is happening, and we go, "Oh no, I've been pretty miserable, because my relationship is on the rocks, and da 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 da, and all these things are going south." That's our very definition of happiness, is everything going the way that our mind of attachment wants it to. So this is the real problem. This is the real culprit. I might point out that when the Buddha taught his very first teaching on the Four Noble Truths, of course, we've all heard teachings on that, I'm sure, the very first noble truth that life is not good, that life is essentially dukkha, unsatisfactory. And then when he talked about in that very first sutra, what are the causes of that, the second noble truth, the main one he pointed to was craving and desire. Because it's the most palpable cause of our suffering, is because we get attached to getting all these things for our happiness. We live our lives like that. Again, junkies born into a world of junk, continually looking for our next fix, right? I gotta get that, I gotta get that, I gotta get that. And then when we don't get it, getting totally bent out of shape. That's the undercurrent, the default mode to our daily lives. We have to start seeing it for what it is, and seeing that it's a problem to get totally preoccupied with these things. Once more, not the things in and of themselves, because you're still going to receive praise, and you're still going to have comfortable, pleasant experiences, and you're still going to have material things in your life, and you're still going to have all these various things that you could have a faulty relationship with. It's to change your mind, and how are you dealing with those things? Are you falling into the default mode of craving and attachment, or are you being wise in doing something different, having a more healthy response rather than a habitual reaction? So he says that's why most people in the world equate attachment with happiness. They fail to see that this is completely mistaken, because they have no experience at all that real happiness, great happiness, can arise only without attachment. This is also important, to really recognize, is that perhaps we haven't experienced this to the degree that we can, but real happiness comes when we don't have the mind of attachment. He says they've never even heard of the peace and happiness that the Dharma can bring, even though it's the experience of the great meditators. I think I had that hyphenated and then I reformatted, and I'll change that later. I'm a perfectionist when it comes to these slides, sorry. So this is the tendency that we have, again, to not see that there's something other than this. Rinpoche would call this the happiness of Dharma, capital D Dharma. In fact, there's a whole course in the Living in the Path series. I think I taught it at TNL once many years ago over on 2nd Street. That was all about the happiness of Dharma. There's a happiness that comes when we're no longer following the mind of attachment. We're no longer caught up in that. We're no longer driven by that. The peace that comes. I mean, when we talk about nirvana, the state where you have abandoned your ignorance, your attachment, your aversion, anger, all of that, all those things, we're talking about a freedom that comes when we fully let go of those mind states that are only the cause of dissatisfaction and suffering. So this is something we all can know, and we can even know it to small degrees as we begin our practice of the Dharma, as we start moving in that direction. There is a happiness that comes when we aren't under the control of these states of mind. Remember, Pema Chodron, in one of her teachings, she said she saw a little cartoon that somebody had saved for her out of the newspaper that had two fish looking at a hook that had a worm on the end of it in the water. And the one fish is telling the other fish, the key is non-attachment. And it's true. It's like, we are like those fish, where we're willing to go for something that we think is going to bring us temporary pleasure, not seeing that it's only going to bring us suffering. Another analogy that Venerable Urbina often uses, that I think comes from the traditional text, is like honey on a razor blade. It's a really kind of gross analogy, because, if you lick honey off of a razor blade, well, you're dealing with something that can cut you, right? Can harm you in that way. Well, this is what we're doing every time we chase after those things. Now, once more, it is possible to separate the pleasure from the attachment. That's the goal of all this work, right? Lama Yeshe actually, according to Venerable Robina, again, I quote her frequently, but she said Lama Yeshe used to always say, the more pleasure, the better, dear. Pleasure is not the problem. It's our relationship to pleasure. How are we working with what brings us pleasure? Are we getting like that, fish going after the worm on the hook and totally being attached to it? Or are we simply allowing it to be an experience, just like the experience of pain or displeasure, difficulty? These are all just experiences. It's what we do with our minds in relation to them that dictates what it is. Otherwise, again, we're going to be like that yo-yo. We're going to get totally excited when everything's wonderful and then totally depressed and down in the dumps when things are awful. This is a sense of equanimity we can bring to our experiences when we have an awareness of what's going on, that we're not going to follow the worm on the hook. We're going to practice non-attachment. So recognizing only temporary pleasure as happiness, they fail to understand. I should change this to we fail. Because again, we're not trying to point to other people. This whole workshop and all the work that we do in Buddhism is about looking at ourselves. We fail to understand how anyone can have happiness without attachment. The way the mind works is such that the dislike of meeting the 4 undesirable objects is directly related to the wish to meet 4 desirable objects. So the more we need objects of attachment, the more likely we are to be disappointed. We often use this word expectation as part of it. I don't know if expectation is actually a word that the Buddha ever used, but that's really a big part of our suffering. We have an expectation. I said it's kind of the default mode. Remember that wonderful phrase I came across one time on the internet? Expectations are premeditated resentments. And it's what happens, right? We have a suffering that we are setting ourselves up for. It's a premeditated suffering that if we totally expect everything to go our way, everything to be wonderful, everything to be just as we want it to be, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment, for resentment. Why? Because that's the nature of existence. That's the whole point the Buddha is telling us in the first noble truth, right? This is not satisfactory. This is not going to work out, folks. You are not going to be able to make sense of samsaric existence under the control of all these factors and make it into something that is permanent and lasting and bringing you everything that you desire. It's not going to work. Okay? I've got maybe 1 or 2 more slides, and then we'll be getting into the more specifics on these. Sorry, when I did my editing yesterday and the day before, I edited out a lot of stuff because, again, this was a course over a number of sessions that we did some years ago here for Thupten Norberling. I'm trying to just take out and focus on these 8. Let's go into the first 2 then. Material gain and loss, right? Having material things, being afraid of losing them, right? And we can see the extremes. And the object is not to look outside as much as to look inside with ourselves. But we can see this in our world, how people who, even if they have a lot of stuff, a lot of things, it doesn't create lasting happiness. And in fact, they might live with more fear of loss. We think that we receive real happiness from our precious objects, Rinpoche says, but that mind of attachment is confused. The temporal happiness we get from attachment is not true happiness. It does not arise by diminishing desire, but by following it. The thing is, if we say desire is one of the problems and what's causing us to suffer, well, then having attachment and desire for things isn't going to get rid of your suffering. It's only going to cause your desire to increase, and therefore you have more suffering. Yeah, we have to stop being friends with desire, following desire. We often call this kind of the ache of attachment. Furthermore, whenever there's attachment, there's fear of losing the object of attachment. I just mentioned that, right? And the stronger the attachment, the stronger the fear. If it's a material object, we always have to keep it in a safe place and lock all the doors. Even if it never gets stolen or lost, we're constantly afraid that it will be. And what's more, maybe some of us are quite okay with our objects. I'm a bit shocked that there's a couple in our neighborhood who I know somewhat well, and they told me once, they said, because I'd gotten locked out of the house right after I'd moved in there. This was like almost 19 years ago now. And they said, oh, if you ever need to to make a call or something, to get locked out of the house or whatever, our door's always open. And I was like, your door's always open? I mean, it's just kind of outrageous in this day and age in Santa Fe. Santa Fe is not a huge city, but many people, maybe even some of you, leave your doors open when you leave, And there's something kind of refreshing about that idea of like, well, I'm just going to not worry about it. It's just not something that is of a concern. But most of us do tend to be somewhat ingrained in that mentality of I need to protect the stuff I have or the house that I live in or whatever it is. And sometimes it's protecting our bodies from, harm. We don't want intruders and what have you. And I'm not saying that it's just purely around material things, but there's kind of an interesting psychology going on there, right? Where we tend to think that we have all of this and we have some fear of losing it. I remember there's a story about, I don't know what meditator this was, a great meditator who was up in his cave and he had very few possessions. And I think somebody had given him something like a clock or a watch or something, which was really, this is one of these, you know, Tibetan or Nepali meditators up in a cave somewhere. Like they don't have lots of worldly possessions around. And he came back from going down to the village to get some food or something to, replenish his stores. And he saw that someone had taken the watch and stolen the watch, and he was actually happy. He said, now I don't have to worry about losing that anymore. It's kind of, there's something that we should, how often, when we've lost something, do we look at it that way? Oh, well, good, now I don't have to worry about that. That's no longer something that can be stolen because it's gone. Yeah. Instead, many people, ourselves at times even, get quite caught up in our material stuff. And this is the world that we live in. And of course, this modern day and age where there's so many more things. Yeah. This isn't quite the same topic, but I was reading something that was talking about how in our day and age, the amount of imagery and things that people are exposed to in the course of 24 hours is like something that many people 100 years ago wouldn't see in their whole lifetime. Think about it. We are like bombarded by all kinds of imagery and things when we go on the internet, when we turn on the TV, when we do this, we do that. It's like unstoppable. This is why you see the benefit, perhaps at times, of being able to isolate oneself from society, do solitary retreat and what have you, because we don't recognize how much we're being bombarded until we're away from all of it. But we are in that space. And when we look at material things and all of the advertising and trying to get us to spend our money here and buy this and buy that, the new improved, iPhone, what are they up to in iPhones now? 15 or something, right? 16? I don't know where they're at. Get this new one because it's better than the old one. I don't know, is it? Or is it just a chain of material things that we want to keep possessing and have the newest this and the newest that? And when something really happens to an object we cherish, it gets lost or destroyed, then the greater our attachment, the greater our suffering, right? So people get really bent out of shape. It's something as insignificant as like grandma's teapot or something that fell off the shelf, and suddenly they no longer have that. We get incredibly upset. Our mood plummets into depression, and our whole face completely changes. Rinpoche's seeing things pretty clearly. The amount of suffering that happens when we've been very attached to something and it's no longer there. So he says, think about some precious object to which you're attached. Maybe we can do that as a little exercise right now. Each of you, think about something to which you're attached to some degree. Maybe some of you feel pretty comfortable with your material things. If you went home from this class or whatever, or came home at a later point today, if you're already at home, like some of our folks online, and everything was gone. All of your possessions were gone. Somebody had, managed to somehow get all that. Or say there was a fire. Hate to think about that, but that happens, right? People lose all their possessions in a fire. You go home, everything's gone. Yeah. Do you have any anxiety about its being lost, stolen, or destroyed? Even though you have that object and are never separated from it, even though that hasn't happened yet, are you still afraid that it will? This is kind of a test of where our attachment is, right? If we look at the stuff that we have and we aren't at that place like the monk in the cave where it's like, okay, now I don't have to worry about losing that. That's out of my life. Of course, again, we're not talking about beings, people, pets, what have you. I mean, that's certainly an objects of attachment. We wouldn't want things to happen to them. That's not a good thought. But when it comes to like the material stuff that we fill our lives with, it is just material stuff. Yes, it affords some benefit and pleasure and convenience often, but it's not the be all and end all of our happiness. And certainly, once more, if we place all of the onus on our happiness on those things, we're going to be disappointed. It's not going to fulfill what we're actually seeking at a much, much deeper level. Okay, let's carry on. I think I got a few more slides on this material on gain and loss. No, I don't. Let me stop it here then, and let's share any reflections people have on that topic. Material gain and loss. I know, again, many of you, if you're, maybe that is part of your Buddhist practice, is having a much simpler life. Having a life where you haven't collected all kinds of priceless objects and things, and pieces of art on the wall. And I'm not saying, again, those things are a problem, but look at the relationship of your mind to them. Do you have that anxiety? Do you have that fear of losing those things? Face it, we're all going to lose them eventually when we die, right? Everything that you own, down to the last penny, is going to be left behind. You can't take any of it with you. I suppose if you're a reincarnated llama, maybe they'll hold on to all your stuff and you'll come back and use it again.
You will identify.
But that's probably not going to happen. Jackie, did you want to share something?
All right. Yes, well, it's just that you casually used the example of your grandmother's teapot that fell, and I suddenly got horrified. And it's not, it wasn't the thought of the vase or the pot that shattered, but the sentimentality.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that elaboration on top of it that it represents something. It's all false coming from the ego, but it's a sentimentality coming from, the elaboration of this relationship that suddenly something broke. Is there more karma? Is there more karma losing something that, or how can I say? Is there more karma involved in a worldly dharma where you have fear loss over something that actually is just material value versus sentimentality because of the strength of emotion involved? Can you understand?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. And having just gone through my mother's passing and dealing with all of her belongings, which, I kept a few things for myself, but I can't say that I really had as much sentimentality about something. But there's a few things where it was like really, and I do feel that kind of power that we give to those objects. But when I think about what happened to all the stuff I left behind, and my sister wasn't interested in, and my brother wasn't interested in, we had somebody came in and they took it all to auction and sold it online. And for the people who bought all that stuff, had none of that, right? That's an overlay that we give those objects. That's something that is from our creation. Now, your question about is there more karma around that kind of thing? Well, there's certainly more suffering, right? We induce more suffering on ourselves by saying that this is a sentimental object because of the relationship it had to a person that we loved and so on. The love that you had for that person isn't the problem, though, right? You can have that love without that object. You can experience the love that the connection you had and what have you, even though they're gone. You can still have that heart of love for them without the object. It's just we tend to infuse the object with another layer of this overlay, this exaggeration. We think it becomes so much more important. In fact, I have a friend who talked about how a friend of his, he would go stay with him sometimes, and this person would be like totally obsessed with grandma's stuff. That's why I brought up grandma's teapot. And like if anything happened, it was like the end of the world. Well, again, the suffering you're going to experience because you've overlaid it with that kind of meaning is much greater. Whereas if you die and somebody else gets that and they don't even know that it's grandma's teapot, they just think it's just an old piece of junk or whatever. And maybe they take it to Antiques Roadshow and find out that it's worth a whole lot of money or something. But they have a totally different relationship. None of that sentimentality is there. So I don't know if it's karma necessarily. Certainly, your karma is going to be influenced by what your reaction is when that happens. If you invite somebody over, like my friend, and it comes in and happens to mistakenly, accidentally knock the teapot off the shelf and it breaks into 28 pieces, and you can't be put back together again. Well, then if that person who owned that and had that sentimentality gets angry and upset and maybe even, says things and does things that they're going to regret, karmically, well, then of course there's going to be a greater karma to that. But we see that it's just mainly the suffering that we experience because we've infused it with so much meaning and sentimentality. Therefore, it's going to create more suffering when we don't have that. But I think that the example of kind of undermining that is that anyone else seeing it wouldn't necessarily have that view at all. I mean, not even if we look at, let's not even talk about sentimentality. Let's talk about the preciousness of objects that we have because of what they mean to us, what the excitement they give to us. Like people who collect things. Actually, for a while, we used to collect little owl figurines. For some reason, I got into owls. My mother was into rabbits, believe it or not. She had like tons and tons of rabbits, and they kept reproducing. I'm not. But the idea is that, if you see this, you buy these objects, you get these objects, or somebody gives them to you as a gift because you like them, because they speak to you. Well, then again, you're already overlaying something on top of it that other people may not have at all. People look at rabbits and they go, okay, what's with the rabbits? It's kind of weird, or what's with the owls? It's kind of weird. They don't have that feeling. They don't have that experience because that's something that is unique to you. And when you lose those things or when you have to separate from them, whatever the case might be, well, then you're going to have a very different reaction because you've infused them with that meaning. That already is undermining a lot of the attachment because we see that that's not how everybody looks at that object. My gosh, go into people's homes. I mean, not saying like, to start opening people's doors and walk into their home, but anybody who you visit, chances are a lot of the stuff that's on their shelves and what have you that they decorate the house with, you're going to go, not my style. It's not something that does anything for me. It's not something that gets me really excited or whatever. We each have our own tastes and our own things that we are attracted to, but those things do not reside in the objects. That phrase we have in our culture of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's so true, right? Because not everybody sees it as beautiful. Not everybody likes the same music that we like. Not everybody eats the same food that we enjoy and, enjoys it, right? Got a few questions here. Does that help, Jackie? I mean, give some context. I'm not saying again that we shouldn't have any fondness for the person on the basis of those objects and recall our love and our connection with them. Those are healthy things. But when it becomes an attachment to where we're going to be totally bent out of shape if something happens to that object, then that's an indication that our attachment is there. And we've overlaid it and maybe strengthened the attachment by virtue of that sentimentality. Because it's not just, oh, this is a nice object. Oh, this is grandma's nice object or my mom's nice object or whatever. Let me check the chat box because I think there were a few things in here that I need to pay attention to. Let me go up a little bit. Okay, I hope it's okay to share some of this. These were comments sent to everybody in the chat box, so I assume when it went to everyone. This is from Danny as well. I was once somewhat of a hoarder, and when I realized this, I couldn't even contemplate getting rid of it. Long story short, it was all destroyed, and since then I'm not attached to things anymore as much. I'm definitely a minimalist now, and what a relief. I've heard that story before about the monk who was relieved when his one item was stolen, and that's how I feel. Even my identity and all its documents were stolen, and I survived and am even better off than before. How wonderful. I mean, it's inspiring to hear these sorts of, ability to work with that level of loss. I know there was a Dharma couple, Judith and Jack, who lived in the Bay Area, who had a fire in their home. Unfortunately, the lives of some of their pets were lost. I think they had a cat and a dog that were lost in that fire. But being Dharma practitioners, they were very good about kind of just dealing with the other sense of loss of having everything gone, everything consumed. And then she went on to say, I see my very life as a sand mandala, and I consciously get rid of things when I notice them accumulating. I even erase texts as soon as I read them, and I don't save emails, even though this sometimes works against me when I'm asked to reference that text someone sent yesterday, right? That does happen. There's some value to that, even just in regard to our minds, not having as much clutter and as many things around. You mentioned being a hoarder, Danny, and I mean, we all have some degree of that, things that we hold on to. And it's good to just be letting things go. an ideal perspective, I suppose, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have anything, but the main thing is when we receive something, we should always be looking at, well, what can I do with that? How can I make that a benefit to others? Be a conduit for material wealth or for whatever is going on, rather than being somebody who it stops here. There's actually a woman named Lynn Twist, I think is her name. She wrote a book called The Soul of Money, and she even gives talks here at Upaya Zen Center sometimes. Her whole thing is that money is meant to move, that resources are meant to kind of be in motion. And when they go to a place and get stuck, then it causes problems. And of course, we see this in Buddhism with where we kind of hoard or hold everything to ourselves, then it becomes a bit of a problem, right? We should be always looking at, well, how can I make use of this? How can I keep it moving? And then another comment, our stuff is only precious to us, to others, it's just junk. I think we touched on that a little bit. The same with pictures of their family, only valuable to them, right? I mean, if you had, somebody put on a garage sale and they were selling pictures of their family to you, would you buy any of it? If you stopped at a garage sale, you'd be like, oh yeah, those are beautiful people. I want to have that hanging in my home. And then Dr. Karen says, my family is Swedish. And I've heard about this, a thing called Swedish death cleaning. I've heard there's even like a TV show and a book or something on this. I don't know. Basically, people get rid of a lot of their stuff so their family doesn't have to do it. I mean, that's another reason why we should be very conscientious around not hoarding too much stuff. Sometimes people do this when they get a terminal illness, but I did it in 2020 because I moved and was moving into a friend's house. I drove so much stuff to Goodwill, books, things I cared about. I took 60 years of life into about 20 boxes, give or take. It was really freeing. Yeah. So again, this is what happens. When I moved in with my friend, I discovered he was a hoarder. I'm surrounded by stuff he shops for every day. Karma? and and she said, LOL, laugh out loud. So yeah, I mean, when we see it in others after, especially if we've dealt with our own stuff, because I always am trying to be careful when we teach the Dharma. The whole thing isn't so I can be aware of what everybody around me is doing and become more aware of it and maybe even critical or judgmental of it. That's not the point at all. It's so that we work on ourselves first, and then when we see it in others, we might have even more compassion, right? Because we see how much people get caught up in these patterns of attachment to things. And I'm sure we've all said that to somebody, oh, it's only a thing, right? When somebody's lost something, something has happened to them, trying to downplay it because we do recognize the impermanent nature of things. Remember, one of the other teachings that Rinpoche said was in this text of opening the door of Dharma was around impermanence. Impermanence is one of the main antidotes to all of these worldly dharmas, to recognize the fleeting nature of this life and how all the stuff that we have in regard to this category of material gain, all that stuff we're going to have to leave behind. And even some of it we're going to have to deal with in this life, of things going out of our possession, things being destroyed, things no longer being something that brings us pleasure. So the attachment is going to make the ache and the pain even greater when that happens. They often encourage you, especially if you haven't done a sort of Swedish death cleaning, like Dr. Karen was mentioning. If you haven't done that before you get to your death, well, you can feel like you've got all this stuff now that you've got to let go of. This can be huge on your deathbed, trying to not just let go of this life and this body and the friends and people in your life, but all this stuff. And then, to put that on somebody else, that's a whole nother story, right? I mean, we were so blessed. I do have to mention this, and we're going to take our lunch break. There was a man in the neighborhood who was very close. He and his wife were very close to my mom. And his business is dealing with estates and going in and doing this. He offered to do this for us, even though there wasn't that much of value in my mother's estate. He told me afterwards that they usually like to get an estate of about $10,000 that will make that much on the market when they do an auction and a online bidding and what have you. And I think my mom's only made about 3,000 in the end. And, but they came in with a crew of people. First day they come in and they box all the little stuff up and all the dishes and all these other things. And the second day they bring a truck and they put everything on the truck. There were about 3 or 4 items that were larger that they couldn't take because there wasn't enough room on the truck. My mother had so much stuff. And this was after we'd taken a few things. Some of the neighbors had taken some things, relatives had taken other things, and there was still that much left. What a blessing, my gosh, we we got rid of it all in the course of 2 days, you know. And a lot of people, of course, have to deal with, a lot of other stuff. I guess that was my mom's good karma with those folks, and our good karma to experience that kind of a smooth dealing with stuff. But nonetheless, think about it now. I mean, what is it going to be like if, and as we know, death can happen at any moment. What if today is your last day? What are you leaving behind that others are going to have to deal with? And of course, that you're also going to have to let go of as you die, as you leave this life. Let's take our 2-hour break. It's noontime, and I'm sorry, a 1.5-hour break. Not 2 hours, 1.5 hours. We're meeting again at 1:30. So it's from 12 to 1:30 here, Mountain Time Zone. So in an hour and a half, we'll reconvene. Before we leave, let's just have a few thoughts as we're going to go about, our lunch break, thinking about the patterns of attachment that arise, and maybe they'll be arising even as you eat lunch. To try to see this as just something that you're experiencing, a pleasant experience, or maybe you get something that isn't as pleasant in your meal. And then to experience those and to recognize that we don't need to have these habitual reactions. Let's try to be able to look at it in that light. Let's dedicate what we've already done, the 2 hours that we spent here already today. May this be the cause for ourselves to develop our minds to the greatest degree, so we can then help others very skillfully. So again, we'll reconvene in 90 minutes and have a good lunch. All right. Thank you, Shayla, for all of your help online, coordinating things, and also to Lou here in the Gompa. All right. See you soon.